Hi, my name is Krista Salazar. I'm an associate professor at pharmacy practice at the University of New Mexico College of Pharmacy and the IPE coordinator representing the College of Pharmacy. Today I will be presenting points for IPE system, also known as pipes. Please note, before you get started on the presentation, it will be useful to have copies of slides 8 and 9 of this presentation for you to reference when we get to that point in the presentation. For your convenience, the PDF version of these slides are located on the UNM IPE website at the link shown on the following slide. PIPES was initially developed by a Delphi study at the University of Toronto, and it was developed to determine how we can value the different types of IPE learning engaged in by students. The Delphi study was conducted to determine the essential components of IPE learning activity. There were 30 participants in this Delphi study. There were 3 groups and 10 persons in each group. There were 10 IPE experts, 10 educational experts, and 10 faculty developer experts. This Delphi study identified 8 criteria for pipes. The Delphi group organized this content into 2 categories. They organized it into process and into content. There were 4 criteria identified within process and 4 criteria that were identified within content. Criteria were measured using a Likert scale. The Likert scale was a 0, 5, and 10 that were used to identify the points associated with particular courses that were offered. So within each section, courses offered little or no IPE activity, an acceptable amount, or strong interprofessionalism. The first of the 2 categories that we're going to talk about today is process. The Delphi study determined process to identify how learning is occurring, and the 4 criteria they identified within the category of process are level of interactivity, facilitators, number of professions represented in student participants, and the frequency of interaction across the learning activity. So in the first criteria, level of interactivity, the system asks, was the course didactic? Were the students passively learning side by side? Or was there discussion? For example, was it a class-led discussion by a faculty member or facilitator? Or did the students actually interact together? Were the students discussing amongst each other? Were they having conversations? Were the students working on something together? The next criteria the Delphi study looked at were the facilitators, and there are 2 elements within this criteria. How many facilitators were there from the different professions, and are the facilitators educated to teach interprofessional education? The third criteria looked at is the number of professions represented by the number of students. Using the Likert scale, a course would receive 0 points if it consisted of only 1 profession, 5 points if it had a group of students from 2 to 4 professions, or if the activity engaged more than 4 different professions, full points would be given. The professions are determined by the professional program, not the specialty practice. So for example, if there were a group of physicians working together and we had a surgeon, a family practice physician, and an endocrinologist, this course would receive a score of 0 points because these individuals would be from the same profession, which in this case would be medicine. The last criteria looked at under process is frequency of interaction across the learning activity. Did the students engage only 1 time? Did they meet 2 to 4 times or more than 4 times? Content was also looked at as far as what is being learned. And again, there were 4 criteria within content, just like there was within process. Within content, is the content a realistic and authentic activity? Does the content have explicit IPE learning outcomes? So we would draw you to the interprofessional education competencies that would help you identify the learning outcomes. Were there debrief periods within this content area? So if there were no debrief periods, the Likert scale would use a score of 1. If there were an informal debrief period, perhaps the students were encouraged to reflect, but it wasn't a guided reflection, they would get somewhere in the midpoint score. But if there were facilitated debriefs and actual discussions being held amongst the students and the students were interacting, then the point system would allow for maximum points. If there was case-based learning, then the Likert scale would be applied to that. Either there would be no cases, there would be a case presentation with some application, or there would be dedicated case presentation with in-depth dialogue among the students. In the next few slides, we will explain each element of the point system and then use an actual IPE course as an example to determine the number of IPE points to assign for that particular course. With your available copies of slides 8 and 9, please refer to them as needed. Now to move forward. This rubric you're looking at right now on this slide was developed to encompass both categories we just looked at. Process, how is learning occurring, and content, what is being learned. This slide is a sample IPE course that we will use to use PIPES to evaluate. In order to complete the PIPES rubric, we are going to need to focus our attention more specifically to the professions of the teaching faculty, the number of faculty teaching, and also the number of those faculty that were trained to teach or facilitate IPE. We're going to look at the professions of student participants, the year or level of the student participants, the setting in which they learned, the class time spent learning from and about, learning with, from, and about one another. And we're going to look closely at a description of the instructional activities, and then look at the description or debriefing periods with the students and facilitators after the IPE activity occurred. So here we're looking at a rubric, completed rubric, and we're going to use our rubric to score that particular class that I showed you in the prior slide. And so we're going to look at the blue section first. That says process and how did learning occur. So if you could look at the first section of process, which is P1, level of interactivity. The faculty member, the instructor of record for this particular class, was the one who completed this rubric, so it was based on their opinion about this class. The faculty member determined that the students were actually interacting. They were talking to each other, they were working on cases together. There was high level of discussion between students. Not just a large group discussion, but literally one-on-one discussion amongst students or within their small group. So the faculty member awarded P1 section of this rubric 10 out of 10 points. Looking at P2, so we looked at the number of facilitators from different professions. If you go back to that prior slide that I encouraged you to make a copy of, you will notice that there was only one faculty member who offered this course. So as a result, in this section, this course received 0 out of 10 possible points. This is shown in the last column on the right-hand side of this slide. Let's stay in P2 for just a moment and look at the facilitators, or in this case, this one facilitator who was indeed formally educated about teaching how to teach IPE. And so in this case, this faculty member was awarded 10 points for this course in this section. Looking at P3, and still in the process section of PIPES, we're looking at the number of professions represented. So looking at the prior slide, the number of professions that were involved in this were an OT student, an MD student, a promotora, a PA student, a pharmacy student, and a hero. So there were 6 professions, and remember, we looked at the number of professions. If it was more than 3, 10 points was awarded for this particular class. If we look at P4, frequency of interaction across learning, 10 points were given, so it must have been greater than 4. If you look back at the prior slide, in the third to the last row, it was offered in the fall session, 2 hours weekly for 8 weeks, and in the spring 2 hours. And the students actually delivered a diabetes education class monthly for that entire spring semester. So I believe it was for 5 months. So the frequency of interaction across learning activity, this course was awarded 10 points. And so it was a 10 out of 10 points. So if we summed up all of the total for process, and 40 points out of 50 were awarded to this class using the PIPE system. So now if we look at content and what type of learning was being experienced, we'll go to C1. The type of learning, was it realistic and authentic? Was it see and hear? This would be more of a lecture type learning environment, or were the students actually talking? Were they dialoguing? So maybe they were doing case-based work. And in this course, indeed, the students did do case-based work, but for the bulk of their activity, they actually did real-life experiences. Remember, they were teaching diabetes classes together. So the instructor of record for this class awarded, using the point system, awarded this class 10 out of 10. If we look at C2 under content, were there explicit learning outcomes? If I remember correctly, this course was offered in the fall of 2011, and so the IPEC competencies were new at the time and were not explicitly voiced in the IPE outcomes for this particular course. So for this course, it did get 0 points in this section. Under C3, debrief periods with the students. So this part of the rubric looks at, was there no debrief? Was there informal debrief? Or again, was it facilitated debrief? And in this particular course, indeed, there was facilitated debrief. There was debrief during all cases that were done in class. There was also a small group debrief when the students delivered the content for the diabetes class after the diabetes class took place. And the debrief section involved what worked well, what didn't work well, and what should we continue doing, and what might we want to consider doing differently in the future. So in this case, this faculty member awarded this course 10 points out of 10. Under case-based learning, we'll slide over to where it defines what 10 out of 10 means. There was dedicated case presentation and in-depth dialogue that occurred. So 10 out of 10 points were offered for this particular course. So out of the total 40 points that could possibly be received under content section, there were 30 points awarded. So this class, in this case, would be awarded 70 points overall. That concludes our presentation on PIPES, a system developed to determine how we can value the different types of IPE learning activities engaged in by students. To learn more about how PIPES was applied to the curriculum at the University of Toronto, I encourage you to visit their website at www.ipe.utoronto.ca and search for Interprofessional Education Curriculum. Links for the University of Toronto Centre for Interprofessional Education are also available on the UNM IPE website under the Resources tab and the Reference links.